Have you ever heard about that time a passenger jet accidentally flew into Soviet airspace and got shot down? Yeah, a commercial flight, not a military one. Parents, kids, business people, all on board. And within minutes, they were gone. This wasn't some random tragedy out of nowhere. It happened right in the middle of the Cold War, when both sides were terrified the other might strike first. And somehow, one tiny navigation mistake turned into a full-blown international crisis that nearly pushed the world to the edge. Today, we're going to piece together what really happened to Korean Airlines Flight 007, how it got lost, why the Soviets pulled the trigger, and how this one shocking night ended up changing global aviation forever. Because trust me, once you see how close this came to sparking a war, you'll never look at air travel or history the same way again. It was just after midnight on September 1st, 1983. A Korean Airlines passenger jet, Flight 007, was cruising high above the Pacific Ocean on its way from New York to Seoul. On board were 269 people, families, students, business travelers, even a U.S. congressman. A routine flight on a typical night. But within hours, this jet would vanish from the sky. No distress call, no warning, just silence. At first, people thought it was some tragic malfunction, maybe engine failure, perhaps a storm. But what came next stunned the entire world. The Soviet Union admitted it had shot the plane down. A commercial airliner, blown out of the sky during peacetime. The news hit like a thunderclap. How could something like this even happen? Why would a superpower launch missiles at a passenger jet? And what was a Korean plane doing inside Soviet airspace in the first place? This wasn't just a simple aviation mistake. It became one of the most explosive moments of the entire Cold War. A single flight that triggered global outrage, political chaos, and decades of unanswered questions. Today, we're going to rewind the clock and trace that night minute by minute, from the moment Flight 007 took off to the confusion on Soviet radar screens and the horrifying order that changed everything. Because this isn't just the story of a plane that got lost. It's the story of how one small navigation error almost pushed two nuclear superpowers to the edge of war. To really understand what happened to Flight 007, we've got to rewind the clock, not just to that night, but to the world it happened in. The year was 1983, and the Cold War wasn't just cold anymore. It was freezing solid. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense standoff that had been ongoing for decades. Both sides had nuclear weapons ready to go, pointed straight at each other, just waiting for a reason. And here's the scary part. Neither side trusted the other. Every satellite image, every radar blip, every plane in the sky was seen as a potential threat. President Ronald Reagan was in the White House, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. And over in Moscow, the new Soviet leader, Yuri Andropov, was convinced that the Americans might actually try a surprise nuclear strike. So tensions weren't just high, they were paranoid level high. Spy planes were constantly flying near Soviet borders. American reconnaissance jets, like the Rs-135, routinely gathered intelligence just outside Soviet airspace. And from the Soviet perspective, every one of them could be the start of an attack. Think about it like this. It was as if both superpowers were standing in a dark room, guns drawn, convinced the other guy was about to make a move. One false step, one misread signal, and the world could go up in flames. Just a few months before the KAL-007 disaster, NATO had been running huge military exercises in Europe, and the Soviets thought it might be a cover for a real invasion. They even put parts of their nuclear arsenal on alert. That's how intense things were. So when a large, unidentified aircraft suddenly appeared on Soviet radar that night, flying straight over their most sensitive military zones, you can imagine what they thought. They weren't seeing a lost passenger plane. They were seeing a threat. That was the Cold War in 1983, a time when a radar blip could spark a crisis and a single misunderstanding could change history. It was the kind of world where mistakes didn't stay small for long, and Flight 007 was about to become proof of that. After refueling in Anchorage, Alaska, Flight 007 was ready for its long overnight leg to Seoul, South Korea. The jet was a massive Boeing 747, the pride of commercial aviation at the time, sleek, powerful, and capable of flying halfway across the world without stopping. Inside the cockpit sat Captain Chun Byung-in, a highly experienced pilot with thousands of flight hours under his belt, along with his co-pilot and flight engineer. They weren't rookies. These were trained professionals who had done this exact route dozens of times before. For them, it was just another long, quiet flight across the North Pacific. The plan was simple. From Anchorage, the plane would follow what's called Route Romeo 20. That's an official flight corridor that keeps commercial jets safely away from Soviet airspace, guiding them along the international boundary all the way to South Korea. Every few minutes, the pilots would check their course using something called the INS, the Inertial Navigation System. Now, if you've never heard of INS, think of it as the 1980s version of GPS, except without satellites. It utilized motion sensors and gyroscopes to track the plane's position automatically. But here's the catch. It wasn't foolproof. If you entered the starting coordinates even slightly wrong or failed to double-check them after takeoff, the system would quietly drift off course, and the crew might never realize it. That's precisely what's believed to have happened on Flight 007. During takeoff from Anchorage, something went wrong, either a slight misalignment or a misstep during setup. The INS thought the plane was following the correct path, but in reality it began veering ever so slightly north of its route. At first, the difference was tiny, just a few miles off. Nothing alarming, but as the hours passed, that invisible drift kept growing, and the jet unknowingly started crossing into restricted airspace. Imagine drawing a straight line on a map, then nudging the pen just a millimeter to the side. By the time you've drawn across the whole page, you're completely off track. Inside the cabin, passengers were settling in for the long night. Cabin lights dimmed, flight attendants served drinks, and most people had no idea they were flying straight toward one of the most sensitive military zones in the world, the Soviet Far East. Up in the cockpit, everything looked perfectly normal. The instruments showed a smooth cruise, the stars were visible through the windshield, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. To the crew, there was absolutely nothing wrong. They were confident they were right where they were supposed to be. But somewhere below them, Soviet radar operators were beginning to notice something strange. A large aircraft that didn't belong there approaching their border from the Pacific. And as that radar blip got closer, a chain reaction was about to begin, one that no one on board Flight 007 could ever have imagined. As Flight 007 continued its smooth journey across the Pacific, everything inside the cabin seemed calm. Passengers were asleep under thin airline blankets. The cabin lights glowed softly. From the cockpit, the ocean below looked like an endless sheet of black glass, quiet, peaceful, and uneventful. But beneath that calm surface, something big was brewing. Because while the crew thought they were flying safely along the international route, their plane had been drifting farther north. They were no longer over open waters. They were about to cross into Soviet airspace, one of the most heavily guarded areas in the world. At that time, the northern Soviet territories, places like the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island, were bristling with radar stations, anti-aircraft batteries, and air bases. This was where the Soviet Union tested its long-range missiles, ran nuclear submarines, and kept a watchful eye on American activity in the Pacific. It was their no-go zone. Even a bird flying through there would have raised alarms, let alone a massive Boeing 747. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Around that same night, a U.S. spy plane, an RC-135 reconnaissance jet, was flying near the area, gathering electronic intelligence. It looked eerily similar in shape and radar signature to a civilian Boeing 747. So when Soviet radar operators picked up a large aircraft heading straight over their sensitive military region, they didn't see Korean Airlines Flight 007. They saw what they thought was another American spy mission. In the command centers deep in Siberia and Sakhalin, alarms went off. Controllers began tracking the unknown target. Their radar screens showed it entering Soviet territory. A clear violation. They scrambled fighter jets to intercept it. Inside those radar rooms, imagine the tension, the uncertainty. They couldn't make out passengers or airline logos. All they saw was a blip, a moving dot. To them, this wasn't a plane full of civilians. It was an intruder, and possibly a threat. Meanwhile, the pilots aboard Flight 007 were completely unaware. Their navigation instruments still showed a steady course. They weren't hearing any radio warnings, and the weather was clear. From their perspective, it was just another routine flight. But below them, Soviet air defenses were mobilizing fast. Fighter jets roared into the night sky from bases on Sakhalin Island. Orders were coming down from Moscow. Identify that aircraft and, if necessary, eliminate it. Think about how fragile this situation was. On one side, a peaceful civilian jet cruising at 35,000 feet. On the other hand, a superpower is terrified of a foreign spy plane intruding into its most secret zone. All it took was one misunderstanding, one wrong assumption, for this situation to turn deadly. As the Soviet pilots climbed higher, closing in on the radar target, the stage was set. Flight 007 had unknowingly flown straight into the middle of a Cold War standoff. And in just a few minutes, this invisible game of cat and mouse was going to become a tragedy that would shock the entire world. High above the Sea of Japan in the dark early hours of September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 continued to cruise steadily through the night sky. The passengers were still asleep. The cabin was quiet. The pilots up front had no reason to suspect anything unusual. But just beneath them, hundreds of miles away on the ground, the Soviet military was on high alert. Radar screens were lighting up with the trace of an unidentified aircraft moving deeper into their territory. And to them, this wasn't some lost airliner. This looked like a U.S. reconnaissance plane gathering intelligence right over their secret bases. On Sakhalin Island, a Soviet air base scrambled two fighter jets to intercept. The pilot leading the mission was Major Gennady Osipovich, an experienced airman flying a Sukhoi Su-15 interceptor. He took off into the night, his afterburners flaring, climbing rapidly toward the mysterious target. From his cockpit, the radar lock beeped. He was closing in. But it wasn't easy. Flight 007 was flying high, over 35,000 feet, near the edge of the Su-15's operational ceiling. Osipovich had to push his aircraft to its limits to get close enough to see it. As he approached, he could finally make out a faint silhouette in the darkness. 4 engines, a large fuselage, blinking navigation lights. This didn't look like a spy plane. It looked civilian. Osipovich later said he could even see the flashing strobe lights in passenger windows along the side. That was the moment of confusion. He radioed back to his command center. It has flashing lights, looks like a passenger plane. But the officers on the ground were still convinced. This had to be an American trick. The U.S. had sent spy planes disguised as civilian aircraft before, they argued. And to them, the timing was too suspicious. An RC-135 reconnaissance jet had been flying nearby earlier that night. They thought this could be another attempt to test Soviet defenses. Meanwhile, Flight 007 kept flying straight, utterly unaware that it was being tailed by fighter jets. The crew never heard any warning messages. The Soviets claimed they sent radio commands and even fired warning shots. But the reality is no one on the passenger jet ever saw or heard them. Different frequencies, poor visibility, and language barriers all combined to create total silence. So there they were, 2 planes flying side by side in the dark. One carrying families heading home, the other carrying missiles is locked and ready. Back in the Soviet command post, the tension reached a breaking point. They believed the aircraft was ignoring orders to land. And now it was heading back out toward international airspace, meaning in their eyes, it was escaping with stolen intelligence. Then came the fateful command. A voice over the radio, "Destroy the target." Major Osipovich hesitated. He knew this could be a civilian plane, but orders were orders. He armed 2 K-8 air-to-air missiles and lined up the shot. At 3:26 a.m. local time, he fired. 2 flashes of light streaked across the night sky. One missile exploded near the tail, and the other struck the wing. Flight 007 jolted violently. Cabin pressure vanished. The plane began to spiral out of control. Within seconds, the 747 disappeared from radar. On the ground, Soviet controllers reported a successful hit. In the air, hundreds of innocent lives were gone, and the world's most shocking Cold War tragedy had just begun. When Flight 007 vanished from radar, no one, not even the Soviet pilots, fully understood what had just happened. For a few tense hours, the world didn't know whether the plane had crashed, landed somewhere, or lost contact. Air traffic controllers in Tokyo attempted to contact the flight. No response. They reached out to other aircraft in the area, hoping someone could pick up the Korean jet on their radios. Nothing. The last radar blip showed Flight 007 over the waters near Moneron Island, just off the coast of Sakhalin. Then, silence. As dawn broke, Japan's Maritime Safety Agency began searching the area. Ships and aircraft from South Korea, Japan, and the United States all joined in, scanning the sea for any trace of wreckage. Days went by. The waves carried only a few scattered fragments. A shoe, a seat cushion, bits of metal. No survivors. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviet government stayed completely silent. No statements, no explanations. The rest of the world was left guessing. But soon, satellite intelligence and intercepted communications revealed the shocking truth. The Soviets had shot down a civilian airliner. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves around the globe. U.S. President Ronald Reagan appeared on television, visibly angry, calling it a massacre. He said there was no excuse, no possible justification for such an attack. International outrage was immediate. Countries everywhere condemned the Soviet Union. Airlines rerouted their flights away from Soviet airspace, terrified that something like this could happen again. And how did the Soviet Union respond? With denial. At first, they claimed they had nothing to do with it, that maybe the plane had crashed on its own. Then, when undeniable evidence surfaced, they admitted shooting it down, but insisted it was a spy mission deliberately sent to provoke them. They called it an act of espionage. They said the jet ignored multiple warnings. They even released radar maps and radio logs, trying to justify their actions. But those claims didn't hold up. Investigators and aviation experts pointed out the obvious. A commercial Boeing 747 is not a stealth aircraft. It flies high, slow, and straight. There's no mistaking it for a military jet when you're close enough to see the flashing cabin lights. And yet, the Soviets wouldn't budge. They blocked international investigators from entering the crash zone and kept their ships patrolling the area, picking up wreckage in secret. Even when divers requested permission to search near Moneron Island, they were turned away. For families of the victims, the waiting was unbearable. Loved ones clung to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had survived. But as days turned into weeks, the truth became harder to ignore. No bodies were ever recovered. No black boxes were handed over. Just debris washing ashore and silence from the other side of the Iron Curtain. This wasn't just a tragedy in the sky. It was a full-blown international crisis, a single act that shattered trust between two superpowers already standing on the edge of nuclear confrontation. And as the world mourned, leaders demanded answers. What exactly happened that night? Why was a civilian plane destroyed? And what were the Soviets hiding beneath the cold waters of the Sea of Japan? Those questions would take years, even decades, to be fully answered. But one thing was already clear. The downing of Flight 007 had changed the Cold War forever. For months after the crash, the world was desperate for answers. How could a massive commercial airliner, filled with innocent people, vanish in one of the most closely watched areas on Earth? But getting those answers wasn't easy. From day one, the Soviet Union controlled the crash site. They had their navies scouring the area around Moneron Island, recovering wreckage in secret. International rescue and recovery teams were kept at a distance. To the outside world, it seemed as though the Soviets were trying to bury the truth, both literally and figuratively. Meanwhile, investigators from South Korea, Japan, and the United States had almost nothing to work with. No flight recorders, no bodies, no access to the site, only a handful of floating debris and a lot of unanswered questions. But they didn't stop digging. The U.S. released satellite photos, radar data, and radio intercepts showing that Soviet pilots had indeed fired missiles at the Boeing 747. That part was clear. What wasn't clear was why. The Soviet Union insisted that Flight 007 was on a spy mission, claiming it had deliberately entered Soviet airspace to gather intelligence, possibly working alongside a U.S. reconnaissance plane flying nearby that same night. It sounded like a convenient excuse, and the world wasn't buying it. A few weeks later, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, launched its own investigation, an independent and neutral group that examined flight paths, radar logs, and radio transmissions. They discovered something fascinating and tragic. Flight 007 had slowly drifted off course from the very start of its journey. Somewhere after takeoff from Anchorage, Alaska, its autopilot had been set incorrectly. Instead of following the intended curved path over the Pacific, the plane flew in a straight line, taking it directly into restricted Soviet airspace over Kamchatka and Sakhalin. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't espionage, it was a simple but fatal navigational error. The pilots had no idea they were off track. In those pre-GPS days, long-range navigation relied on radio beacons and inertial guidance systems that were accurate most of the time, but not foolproof. And on that night, over the dark North Pacific, minor errors added up until they became deadly. However, even after this evidence came to light, the Soviets still wouldn't admit fault. They doubled down, claiming the plane ignored warnings that they fired in defense. To the rest of the world, it felt like the truth had been locked away forever. Then, years later, everything changed. In 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, new Russian authorities finally handed over the long-lost flight recorders, the black boxes that had been secretly recovered from the seabed years earlier. And what they contained confirmed what many had already suspected. The cockpit voice recorder revealed calm, routine conversation, not a single hint that the crew knew they had entered hostile airspace. No signs of panic, no mention of warnings, just confusion in the final seconds before the missile struck. It was heartbreaking. These were ordinary pilots flying a routine route. Not spies, not soldiers. The data recorder also matched the ICAO's findings. The plane had drifted off course gradually, never turning intentionally toward Soviet territory. After decades of denial, the truth was undeniable. Flight 007 was shot down because of a tragic misunderstanding, made worse by fear, secrecy, and political pride. But out of that tragedy came one lasting change that still shapes our world today. In 1983, not long after the incident, U.S. President Ronald Reagan announced that once GPS, the satellite navigation system initially built for military use, was fully developed, it would be made available for civilian use. His reasoning was simple. If pilots had access to precise, real-time navigation data, something like Flight 007 would never happen again. So in a way, the loss of 269 lives didn't just expose the dangers of the Cold War, it forced the world to make flying safer for everyone. Every time your phone shows your location, or your plane follows an invisible path across the sky, you're seeing a legacy born from that tragedy. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, change and progress can still find a way to rise from the wreckage. When we look back at the story of Korean Airlines Flight 007, it's more than just a Cold War headline. It's a story about misunderstanding, about fear, and about how one small error can spiral into something unimaginable. Think about it. This was a regular passenger flight. Families, business travelers, kids are on their way home. No weapons, no secret mission. Just people trying to get from one place to another. And yet, in the charged atmosphere of 1983, when both the U.S. and the Soviet Union saw the world through suspicion, one wrong blip on a radar screen was enough to unleash catastrophe. In the days after the tragedy, the world was furious. The United States condemned the Soviet Union for what it called a crime against humanity. The Soviets, in turn, accused America of provoking the situation with spy planes and propaganda. It was a state of chaos, politically, emotionally, and diplomatically. However, as time passed, that anger gave way to something more important: reflection. This tragedy forced the world to confront a hard truth. Technology, politics, and human decisions are deeply intertwined. And when communication breaks down, Even the most advanced systems can fail in the worst way. Out of that loss came change. The GPS, which was once a strictly military tool, was opened for civilian use following the incident with Flight 007. That decision alone has saved countless lives, not just in aviation, but in how we navigate our world today. Your car's navigation, your phone's map, your airline's route planning, all of that exists because leaders decided no one should ever get lost like that again. But the legacy isn't just technical, it's also human. This incident highlighted the fragility of peace when nations ceased to trust one another. It reminded both superpowers and the rest of us that behind every radar dot or political statement are people, people who want to go home safely. Even today, when we see global tensions rise or when nations play dangerous games of brinkmanship, this story stands as a warning from the past that fear, secrecy, and pride can cost lives. That transparency and communication aren't just diplomatic niceties, they're lifelines. So as we remember the 269 lives lost on Flight 007, it's not just about what happened that night in 1983. It's about what it taught the world, that even in the darkest moments, when the sky itself becomes a battleground, humanity can still learn, adapt, and build something better. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real legacy of Flight 007.